Hello again, I'm James Bays. It's 1 month since the UN-backed ceasefire came into effect, but the violence in Syria continues. On Thursday, the deadliest attacks yet. 2 explosions rocked the city of Damascus, killing 55 people and injuring at least 400. Hours later, another bomb went off in Syria's second city of Aleppo, killing 12 people, and the government says another large attack was foiled also in that city. With the Syrian government and the opposition blaming each other, who is responsible? And has what started as a peaceful protest more than a year ago now been hijacked by external forces? Well, that's the allegation being made by Syria's ambassador to the United Nations. The Syrian envoy says there's been an increase in, quote, the scale and frequency of terrorist activities and operations in Syria. He goes on to say the terrorist operations committed in Syria bear the fingerprints of Al-Qaeda. But those accusations have been repeatedly disputed by the opposition. Here's the Syrian National Council leader, Burhan Ghalion, pinning the blame for the attacks firmly on the Syrian government.
لذلك أنا أعتقد أنه لا بد للمجتمع الدولي.
The countries that voted for Annan's plan, they should realize that they have to take initiative and they should apply real pressures on the Syrian regime with very strong will. So the regime should and will stop its operations and attacks. Then this initiative should also confirm that the international committee should send an international investigation committee which is independent, so we'll show who is really behind these explosions.
Thursday's bombings are by no means the first. In December last year, 2 suicide bombs went off outside security buildings in Damascus, killing 44. The opposition was quick to lay the blame on Bashar al-Assad's government. American officials blamed Al-Qaeda. A month later, another suicide attack hit Damascus, killing 26. The Syrian government promised to respond with what it called an iron fist. In April, a further 9 people were killed when a suicide bomber blew himself up in the Al-Midan neighbourhood of Damascus. Well, let's discuss all this. Who might be behind the bombings? We have a panel of experts. From Boston, Omar Dahi, a Syrian native who travelled to the country last year at the peak of the uprising. Omar's also a professor at Hampshire College in Amherst. From Dubai, Mustafa Alani, Director of Security and Defence Department at the Gulf Research Centre. Mustafa is also an advisor to the Middle East Department at London's RUSI. And from London, James Denselown, Middle East analyst at King's College and founder of a new diplomacy platform. Mustafa, I'd like to start with you. You're an expert for so many years in these areas. I know we have no forensic evidence we can look at. We have no hard facts. But who do you think is behind these bombings?
Well, I believe what the representative, Syrian representative to UN, what he said. He said some of these attacks is the responsibility of Al-Qaeda. Yes, I agree 100% that some of these attacks, there's other parties responsible as well, apart from the intelligence, the Syrian intelligence and local. Let's first, to decide who was responsible, let's look at the background of this. Levant, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Palestine have deep root of the jihadis, Salafis movement. This is not new. And especially in the Palestinian refugees camp, Ain al-Hilwa, Nahr al-Barid, Yarmouk, and Erbil. So we are not talking about something new. This ideology have deep root in the Levant, and especially in Syria and Lebanon. So you're
suggesting these attacks may have been originated in Lebanon, because some have suggested Al-Qaeda coming from Iraq?
Well, Iraq is another story, another part of the story, but Syria have a long history of the group which is adopted the ideology of Salafis, jihadis. But we have 2 groups in Syria before the Arab Spring, very visible. We have first group which is created by Syrian intelligence after 2003 to serve basically to help the Al-Qaeda fighter to cross the border. And this was under the Salafis, jihadis, no doubt about it. And most of those people are suicide bombers. They were under the control of the Syrian intelligence. And we have one of this group, which we call Ghuraba al-Sham. And it's well known under Mahmoud Aghassi leadership. And this was associated with the Syrian intelligence and sent thousands and thousands of suicide bombers to Iraq.
OK, Mustafa, can I stop you there? If that group is still involved, are they still working for the Syrian government, or have they changed allegiance?
No, the leader was assassinated in September 2007. and the Syrian basically dismantled this group in 2009. But we have another group which was fighting the regime, not supporting the regime, but like Fatah al-Islam. Fatah al-Islam actually carried a suicide attack in September 2008 against exactly in Al-Qazzaz quarter, and exactly against this security headquarters, the Palestine security headquarters. 17 people were killed in this attack in 2008. So we have a group working against the regime, we have a group of working with the regime, and we have the intelligence. Some of the attacks bear the whole mark of the intelligence, because it's not a suicide bombing, it is a car left in populated area, and the regime have a lot of interest to show that it is basically the fight is not between the people and the regime, the fight between the regime and a group of terrorists.
OK, let's get James's perspective. Who do you think could be responsible, or do you agree with Mustafa? It's probably a mix.
Definitely. I mean, Al-Qaeda is a franchise, and it's sort of as a start-up in different places across the region. So the Al-Nusra Front could be exactly that, a coming together of interests of people with potential battle and explosive training from Iraq or from Lebanon.
Can I just stop you there, James? Can I stop you there for our viewers? The Al-Nusra Front is the name that has come up on certain statements, certain videos that have claimed responsibility. That's right, isn't it?
Exactly, and as I say, these groups can be very homemade. They don't require deep leadership structures or organisational networks. And there's a plethora of weapons and explosives in the region, and there is a porous border with Iraq by which these people can move back. And it's very interesting that Al-Qaeda in Iraq has made some statements online, which has led the Americans, who monitor these very closely, to call this an Al-Qaeda attack. Now, one thing I would go back sort of an extra step and ask a tactical question here is, these were two bombs. One bomb went off, and classic Al-Qaeda tactic, the second bomb therefore targeted the crowd that gathered. Now, that is a tactic to kill civilians, not necessarily target effectively the building itself, the Palestine Military Intelligence Office, which has also been targeted in 2008. So if this group was attempting to kill civilians, I think we can safely say it's got a different agenda to one that is purely anti-regime.
Let's get Omar's take on this in Boston. I know, Omar, you were inside Syria last year, visiting parts of Syria. I've just come back, actually, from Syria, from a short visit, and I spent time with some members of the Free Syria Army there. Now, those commanders of the Free Syria Army said if we could get to Damascus, to where these attacks are taking place, then we'd actually be controlling the area. We'd have vast numbers of demonstrators and protesters on the streets. Omar, do you think the Free Syria Army have any hand in this?
I don't think so. I generally agree with what was said by the other guests in terms of the fact that it's hard to tell who's exactly responsible, and that the regime itself has cultivated ties with different groups, especially in the aftermath of the US invasion of Iraq. But I think it's important to stress that regardless of who is responsible, and I don't think it's useful to try and pin the blame since we don't know, as you mentioned, but regardless who is responsible for this particular attack, the Syrian people are paying the price of the Syrian regime's response to the uprisings. And it's important to remember that the Syrian regime has had a targeted campaign of trying to destroy the mostly nonviolent protests last year and to drag the uprising into an armed response. And I think the increasing sectarian language of the regime, the mass arrests, targeted killings, detentions, and the sort of hate crimes and lynchings even that we saw that were leaked in the videos were intended to evoke a sort of response. And I think what you're seeing in general is a tragic, predictable outcome of this collapse of the security situation as a result of this, whether it is in this particular attack or other things that are happening throughout the country. I think you see this unfolding in front of our eyes, where very much all the Syrians are suffering as a result of this iron fist. I mean, this iron fist approach is the problem that got us here in the first place. And the Syrian regime cannot be trusted to basically oversee the solution, because they themselves are culpable. When they're fighting these so-called armed groups, if they exist, they're fighting them to protect themselves, to protect the regime, not to protect the Syrian people, because the Syrian regime is also attacking demonstrations whenever they occur, which are mostly nonviolent.
Mustafa, I'd like with you to examine the Iraq link a little bit further. You were telling us before about the arms and fighters that were crossing during the war in Iraq. What hard evidence do we have that that flow is now reversed and these weapons and fighters are now heading into Syria?
I think that we witnessed an agreement in 2010 between the Iraqi government and the Syrian government. There's economic exchange and financial help, that the Syrians decide to close the border and to stop sending fighters. And actually the Iraqi government admitted that there's no more fighters coming, especially from the western part of Iraq. Still some fighters coming from Mosul side, from Aleppo side. But from the main borderline, there is evidence. But I want to say something about Jabhat al-Nusra. Jabhat al-Nusra, we have two groups emerged since March this year, which involve in terrorist attack. We have Jabhat al-Nusra, which headed by someone called Abu Muhammad al-Julani. He's a Syrian. And he came in a video, he produced two videos now, claiming responsibility about the previous attack. The other one's called Kata'ib Ahrar al-Sham. And this is headed by an ex-military called Abdullah Rashid. Again, we don't know what is his name. And both are Syrian. At least publicly, we know these two groups which accept responsibility for this attack, headed by Syrian, we don't know, but basically from their statement. So, and the Iraqi connection, here you're talking about not only Iraqi connection. We have Lebanese connection very strong, because Ain al-Hilwa and Nahr al-Barid. In 2007, we have a very strong group working there, Jund al-Sham. And we have another group called Asbat al-Nusra. This group was heavily involved in Iraq through Syria, sending fighters, Palestinian fighters from the Palestinian camps, and Lebanese fighter and Syrian fighter, with the cooperation of the Syrian government, to Iraq. So we're talking about thousands and thousands, and many of them are suicide bombers. So it's not necessarily, it is only in Syria, possibly those people coming from across the border. We have to remember, you know, jihadist terrorist group never recognize political border. They don't recognize political border. When you have a jihadist field, they move to the jihadist field. It's like the magnetic, like what happened in Iraq or in Afghanistan. So I'm not surprised that it is a mix of Syrian and non-Syrian going to work, and some of them belong to Al-Qaeda, some are not.
You mentioned Iraq and Afghanistan, James. I assume that the Western intelligence agencies looking at this must be deeply worried, and it must be feeding into their calculations of how much support to give the opposition in general.
Indeed, it's very difficult for the Americans, who have made it very clear that they don't want the regime of Bashar al-Assad to survive in Syria, yet would not want that to be replaced by a situation of state collapse and the prevalence of groups like Al-Qaeda-esque groups. And I think Yemen and Somalia are both good examples as to what they would least like to want. I was speaking to an American general a couple of months ago about the status of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and they were talking about a group that was largely beaten and marginalized in Iraq and had only 800 or so members. So it's interesting whether a true franchise can pick up in Syria, and Al-Qaeda in Syria. We are only just over a year into this conflict that's increasingly violent and increasingly multifaceted. Al-Qaeda thrives in areas where the state cannot impose its rule and where there is a significant sectarian clash. Both of these things are on the increase in Syria, and so I think we might look at this bombing last week as a sort of a milestone towards a sort of far more Iraq-like process.
Omar, can I ask you about the role of Al-Qaeda? Do you believe Al-Qaeda is an independent actor, or do you think Al-Qaeda is present in some places in the Free Syrian Army? Because certainly the fighters I was with of the Free Syrian Army, they said they had some volunteers, some who'd even served in Iraq, but they said they were under their overall command, a command that was made up of those that had defected from the National Army.
Yes, I mean, I believe the majority of the Free Syrian Army are defectors from the regular army, and perhaps volunteers who have taken up arms, maybe in self-defense. But it's possible. I mean, it depends if you refer to Al-Qaeda as a coherent organization or as a homogeneous organization, which it isn't by any means, or a group of loosely affiliated people who have a certain ideology. And I think it's certainly possible that volunteers, fighters who belong to the organizations that were discussed earlier are basically carrying out attacks, and it's possible that they're claiming to be part of the Free Syrian Army, or it's possible that they're acting on their own. It's really hard to say at this point. As I mentioned, the fact that there's a general collapse in the effective control of the regime, and also the fact that you find basically steady deterioration in the security situation. You're going to see more of these, unfortunately, more of these things occur. So it's quite possible that members of Al-Qaeda are carrying out these attacks.
Of course, gentlemen, we've now reached quite a key point. It's now 1 month since the start of the UN-backed ceasefire, a tattered ceasefire. The UN, former UN Secretary-General Kofi Annan, who's now the UN Special Envoy, said that violence is continuing. He blamed both sides, but he said that his peace plan was the only way to stabilise the situation.
I also told members of the Council that I believe that the UN supervision mission is possibly the only remaining chance to stabilize the country. And I'm sure I'm not telling you any secret when I tell you that there is a profound concern that the country could otherwise descend into full civil war. And the implications of that are quite frightening. We cannot allow that to happen.
Gentlemen, the words of the UN and Arab League envoy Kofi Annan there. James, we also this week had a bomb attack that narrowly missed the UN peacekeepers. That must be one of the nightmare scenarios, injuries or deaths among those UN monitors.
Well, I think that would quickly end what is becoming increasingly the only game in town. There's no international consensus on any further ability to intervene in Syria. The Russians and the Chinese will prevent that at the United Nations. The Americans and the West have simply no stomach for any further intervention in Syria. So what we're seeing is a ceasefire that's only a ceasefire in name, daily reports of artillery attacks, bombings, counterattacks, this kind of violence we saw this week with suicide bombs. I think it's really difficult to work out what's going to happen next in Syria and whether we're going to simply see a daily grind of violence that will essentially one day become unreported. Because think about Iraq today has an endemic problem of car bombs. It simply doesn't become news because it is so common, and that may well be the future for a very violent and fragmented Syria.
Omar, do you think the ceasefire is having any effect now? I spent 3 days in Al-Qusayr, which is a strategic place close to the Lebanese border. There, people were telling me, yes, there are breaches of the ceasefire, but it's reduced the level of violence. Do you think the ceasefire 1 month on is working, Omar?
Well, it's obvious that the regime did not abide by the ceasefire, but I do think it's important to note that the introduction of the monitors and the continuation of this process is having an effect on reinvigorating the demonstrations. What we saw in the last 2 Fridays, yesterday and the Friday before, were some of the largest demonstrations that we've seen since the peak of the uprising last year. And in fact, in some cases, in terms of the number of points, geographic areas throughout the country that we've witnessed demonstrations, we've seen perhaps more than before. So I think it's important to keep in mind that, yes, it is unpredictable really what might happen, but that the way to go is to increase the number of monitors and peacekeepers. And that's why I think the targeting of the monitors, in my view, if you ask who benefits from this, it's clearly the regime. Clearly the regime wants to have a lockdown on the country as much as possible in order to continue its repression. And I think the more that there's pressure on allowing independent, neutral observers to come in will slowly reinvigorate the nonviolent uprising, the nonviolent protests. And on the international level, of course, more pressure on Russia and China, because I think there's a sort of tacit, perhaps, or unwritten agreement between Russia and China on the one hand and the US on the other hand, that has produced the type of Kofi plan. So I think there needs to be pressure at the same time to put pressure on the Syrian government to introduce meaningful political liberalization. Yes, they're saying they won't do it, but they have to do it ultimately. Otherwise, the country is going to continue sliding into the chaos that is happening.
Mustafa, much of the attention has been on the ceasefire, but I was speaking to a senior UN official in the UN peacekeeping department who said we're going to try and put, the UN are going to try and put the emphasis back on the whole six-point plan, because, of course, the ceasefire is only part of one point, isn't it?
Yes, the Annan plan, intentionally or unintentionally, came to save the regime at the end of the day. Because, for a very simple reason, the political roadmap is not clear. We're talking about ceasefire. We're talking about the regime have the ability and the right to maintain, remove only heavy arms. What is heavy armament, you know? They can keep a lot of arms inside the cities, and they can do what they want. The question is, the problem with this plan is not treating equally the both sides. Recognizing, respecting the sovereignty of Syria. Sovereignty of Syria is the power, the authority of the government, and the authority of government, that means the authority of the regime at the end of the day. So it's basically this plan dealing with the regime and asking the regime to reform. As you're asking, you know, Turkey to celebrate Christmas. How the regime going basically to a political process where the regime going to basically walk to its death gradually. So if you give the people the right, equally right, if the people have the right to demonstrate, if the people have the right to have a free access to free media, if which is the plan touch very, is not deeply, it's just a touch from outside. Okay, we're talking about we're going to remove the regime by political means, by diplomatic means, by the agreement of the regime. I don't know how this is going to be achieved. The regime will never sign its death warrant. And
okay, Omar, one of the other points in the plan, which is probably easier for the regime to accept, is the humanitarian assistance. Now, when I was in Syria, it was clear to me these people aren't getting the sort of help they need. They need food, they need medicines, they're not getting them, Omar. From what you're hearing from people inside Syria, it's a desperate situation, isn't it, right now?
It absolutely is. The economy is in dire straits. Situation is getting worse. It's pretty bad in Damascus, and I can imagine much worse everywhere else outside the big cities. And I think I agree that it is morally unacceptable, of course, the way that both sides are treated equally. The overwhelming repression has been by the regime, and so forth. And I do agree that the regime will not sign its death warrant, but I think it's important to realize that this was a concession by the regime. Despite the fact that they may believe that they benefited from the Kofi Annan plan, and to some extent I agree that it benefited the regime in the sense that it gave them some space to maneuver, it gave them a chance to regroup and so forth. But it is also a concession. I mean, who would imagine a year ago that the regime would ever allow something like this to happen? So you have to not lose sight of the accomplishments of the uprising, and of course, in this case, under unfortunate circumstances, that had these monitors come in. And I think that's the only way forward. Humanitarian assistance, trying to assist the Syrian people to carry out the uprising, to take their destiny into their own hands, because it is slowly, of course, as we can see, slipping away from them.
Okay,
but unfortunately, that's the only game in town.
It's the only game in town we've just heard, James, and we're not really going to get any other suggestions, are we, on the table from the Americans until the end of the US election?
Indeed, but I still think we can work harder as an international community to support the Syrian opposition. We started this show by saying, was this the opposition? Clearly, the opposition to Bashar al-Assad's regime is hugely diverse and may include the Free Syria Army and start-up jihadist group like the Al-Qaeda franchise we've discussed. So clearly, working to support the regime, the opposition, both outside and inside the country, towards a transitionary process, towards a more coherent, collective approach to this issue, can provide the silent majority of Syrians with a real alternative. Because, of course, most people would have seen in Damascus the kind of suicide bombs they would have witnessed in Baghdad, the reason they would support the state, so they don't need to kind of go down this dark avenue to go down the Lebanon, the Iraq route, and they'll be very reluctant to give up that without some sense of assurance that the regime can be effective and a proper and a democratic transition to a better future.
Thank you very much to to our panel: Omar Dahi from Boston, Mustafa Alani from Dubai, and James Denselown from London. And thanks very much to you for watching. Al Jazeera's coverage of the situation in Syria continues in our bulletins 24 hours a day. And if you want to catch this programme again, you can find it online. Our website is aljazeera.com. That's it from me and the team. Bye-bye for now.